The year is 1910. A former American president, one of the most powerful men in the world, steps off a train into the heart of Europe. He's been to the wild frontiers of the American West. He's hunted lions in Africa. He's shaken hands with kings and generals. But here, in the city of Budapest, Theodore Roosevelt is genuinely stunned. He stands before the crowds and says, and I'm paraphrasing, that Hungary is one of the greatest historical nations he has ever encountered. That there is a freedom, an intrepidity, a raw energy in the Hungarian spirit, unlike anything he has seen. Coming from Teddy Roosevelt, that is not a small compliment. But here's the thing that makes this story extraordinary. Just 60 years before Roosevelt's visit, Hungary had been crushed, humiliated, occupied. Its leaders were executed or exiled, its parliament abolished, its flag banned, its very identity as a nation nearly erased from the map. So how did a nation go from total subjugation to being called one of the greatest in the world in barely 2 generations? That is the story we're telling today. The rise, the fall, the rebirth, and the ultimate fate of the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy, the empire that shocked Europe and then vanished in the blink of an eye. To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the pain. In 1849, Hungary tried to break free from Austrian rule. It launched a full-scale revolution, a war of independence that sent shockwaves across Europe. It failed. And the Austrian emperor, young Franz Joseph, just 18 years old when he came to power, had no intention of showing mercy. 13 Hungarian military leaders were executed. Leaders of the revolution were publicly hanged. Hundreds more were imprisoned, beaten, or sent to labor camps. The Hungarian parliament was dissolved. Local governments dismantled. The Hungarian language stripped from official use. And just to make the point crystal clear, the Austrians built a massive fortress, the citadel, right on top of the hill overlooking Budapest, with its cannons aimed directly at the city below. The message was simple: we are watching. Do not try again. The regime controlled everything. A secret police network of informants reported on every whisper in every cafe. Censorship was absolute. Even wearing a beard in the style of the revolutionary leader Lajos Kossuth could get you arrested. Owning an old banknote from the revolution era, a punishable offense. This wasn't just political oppression, it was cultural erasure, an attempt to make Hungarians forget who they were. But here's what the Austrians didn't count on. You can silence a people, but you cannot erase their memory. When you cannot fight with weapons, you fight with silence. That was the Hungarian strategy. Passive resistance. Hungarian nobles refused to take government positions. Ordinary people found ways to avoid paying taxes. Across the country, people wore black, not for a funeral, but as a permanent statement of mourning for their lost freedom. Hungarian-style fashion became a quiet act of rebellion. Women wore bracelets engraved with the initials of the executed Erud martyrs, the 13 generals who had died for Hungary's freedom. And then there were the exiles. Lajos Kossuth, the man who had led the revolution, refused to give up from abroad. He traveled through Europe and America, giving passionate speeches, building alliances, looking for any opportunity to reignite the flame. But back inside Hungary, the man who would truly shape the future wasn't a revolutionary. He was a lawyer, a politician, a man of extraordinary patience. His name was Ferenc Deák, and the Hungarians called him something that tells you everything about who he was: the wise man of the nation. Deák believed that Hungary's freedom would not come from another failed revolution. It would come from negotiation, from intelligence, from waiting for exactly the right moment. And in the mid-1860s, the right moment arrived. Austria was losing. First war against the French-Italian alliance in northern Italy. Austria lost. Then incredibly war against Prussia in 1866. Austria lost again, decisively, in a matter of weeks. These weren't just military defeats, they were existential crises. The Habsburg Empire, one of the oldest dynasties in European history, was suddenly looking fragile, weak, irrelevant. Franz Joseph was smart enough to realize if this empire was going to survive, he needed Hungary on his side, not as a conquered territory, as a genuine partner. Deák had been waiting for this, and in 1867, after years of delicate negotiation, the compromise was signed. Hungary got its parliament back, its own government, its own prime minister. Hungarian became an official language of state. For the first time since 1848, Hungarians could govern themselves. And who did Franz Joseph, the man who had once ordered the executions of Hungary's leaders, appoint as Hungary's first Prime Minister? Count Gyula Andrássy, a man who, back in 1849, had been sentenced to death in absentia for leading the revolution. A man who had spent years in Parisian exile, where the ladies of Paris, charmed by his looks and dramatic story, nicknamed him the handsome hanged man. In June 1867, at the coronation ceremony in Budapest, it was Andrássy himself who placed the crown upon the head of Franz Joseph, the very man who had once ordered him executed. Think about that for a moment. History has a dark sense of humor. Not everyone celebrated. Lajos Kossuth, still in exile, still refusing to compromise, wrote an anguished open letter to Deák, warning him, "Do UN take the nation to a point where the future can no longer be under her own control." It was a prophecy, and one day it would prove painfully accurate. But for now, Hungary was back. The Austro-Hungarian Monarchy was born, and what came next? Nobody could have predicted. Before we get to the economic miracle, we have to talk about Sissi, because behind every great political deal, there's usually a human story. And in this case, the human story is fascinating. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known across Europe simply as Sissi, was one of the most famous women of the 19th century, renowned for her extraordinary beauty, her love of independence, and her deep distrust of the rigid protocols of the Viennese court. She felt trapped in Vienna, suffocated by the rules, and she found her escape in Hungary. Sissi learned to speak Hungarian fluently. She pushed Franz Joseph, her husband, to write letters to her in Hungarian. She immersed herself in Hungarian history, literature, and culture. She spent as much time as possible at the Jegdal Palace, outside Budapest, and she formed a genuine, lasting friendship with Andrassy. Historians believe Sissi played a significant role behind the scenes in encouraging Franz Joseph toward the Compromise of 1867. She genuinely loved the Hungarian people, and they genuinely loved her back. When Sissi was assassinated in Geneva in 1898, stabbed by an anarchist who had never even met her, Hungary went into mourning. Even today, more than a century later, Hungarians still leave flowers in Hungarian national colors at her tomb in Vienna. Red, white, and green. She was not Hungarian by birth, but she was Hungarian by heart. Now the economic miracle. The decades between 1867 and 1914 are remembered in Hungary as the Golden Age. And when you look at the numbers, that title is completely justified. In 1846, just before the revolution, Hungary had its first railway line. It ran between Pest and Visé, a short stretch of track, nearly 40 miles long. By 1913, less than 70 years later, Hungary had 22,000 kilometers of railway network, 22,000 carrying 166 million passengers every single year. Hungary went from an almost entirely agricultural economy to becoming a genuine industrial power. Machine manufacturing, vehicle production, electrical engineering, chemical industries. Hungarian factories were competing successfully with the largest American and German companies. In Budapest, engineers at the Ganzworks factory invented the transformer, the device that made it possible to transmit electrical power over long distances, an essential piece of technology that still powers the modern world. They also invented the injector for internal combustion engines. And in 1902, they built the world's first electric railway line in Italy. Hungary's GDP growth rate was one of the fastest in Europe. And yet, and this is important, it still wasn't enough to employ everyone. So approximately 1 million Hungarians emigrated to the United States around the turn of the century, most intending to work for a few years and come back. In Cleveland alone, in the early 1900s, there were 7 Hungarian-language newspapers being published, 7 in one American city, and then there was Budapest itself. In 1901, the US government formed a commission to study the best urban planning in the world. They visited 6 cities. Budapest was one of them, and it deserved to be. Budapest in 1900 was one of the most magnificent cities on earth. Wide tree-lined boulevards, eclectic architecture, grand hotels and theaters and opera houses rising along both banks of the Danube. The Budapest Opera House was considered more beautiful than the opera houses in Vienna and Paris. The New York Café was celebrated as the most lavish coffee house in the world. And the Hungarian parliament, still standing today on the banks of the Danube, was, when it was completed, the largest parliamentary building on the entire planet. Budapest had the first underground railway in continental Europe. It was one of the first cities in the world to use electric streetcars and incandescent lights at scale. This was not a nation recovering from defeat. This was a nation exploding with ambition. And it wasn't just in Hungary where Hungarians were making their mark. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor at Budapest's Rókas Hospital, discovered the cause and prevention of puerperal fever, a disease that was killing mothers in childbirth across Europe at horrifying rates. He figured it out decades before germ theory was even widely accepted. History gave him the name Savior of Mothers. Tivadar Puskas worked directly with Thomas Edison in the United States. He came up with the concept behind the world's first telephone exchange, implemented in Boston in 1877. He later established exchanges in Paris and Budapest. And in 1892, in Budapest, he created the world's first electronic news and entertainment broadcasting service, basically a proto-radio, 50 years before radio became mainstream. The legendary Ford Model T, chosen as the car of the century, had 3 designers. 2 of them were Hungarian. József Galam's contribution was particularly significant. Hungary was also there at the birth of the modern Olympics. In a photograph taken at the first Games in Athens in 1896, a Hungarian, Dr. Ferenc Kemeny, can be seen sitting among the 7 founding members of the International Olympic Committee. And in the pool at those same Games, Hungarian athlete Alfred Hajós won both the 100-meter and 1200-meter freestyle swimming events. Oh, and he was also the Hungarian football champion. Naturally. So what do we make of all this? The Austro-Hungarian monarchy lasted exactly 50 years. From the Compromise of 1867 to the end of World War I in 1918, for much of Hungarian society at the time, the Compromise was a betrayal. They felt that Dík had surrendered the dreams of 1848, the dream of a fully independent Hungary in exchange for a comfortable partnership with the very empire that had crushed them. And in some ways, they were right. Under the dual monarchy, Hungary never controlled its own military or foreign policy. Those remained with the emperor in Vienna. Hungarian soldiers fought and died in wars that Hungarian politicians had no say in. But most historians also acknowledge that what Hungary achieved during those 50 years was extraordinary. The economic growth, the cultural explosion, the global reputation, the physical transformation of Budapest from a provincial town into one of the great cities of the world. These were real, lasting, remarkable, and yet Kossuth was right. When war came in 1914, a war Hungary did not start, did not want, and could not prevent, the Hungarian people had no control over their own destiny. They were pulled into a catastrophe not of their making. By 1918, the empire was gone, dissolved, shattered, and in the peace treaty that followed the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and 1/3 of its ethnic Hungarian population to neighboring countries. The Golden Age was over, and the price Hungary paid was devastating. The Austro-Hungarian Monarchy is gone, but its legacy is still visible everywhere. In the grand boulevards of Budapest, in the Parliament building on the Danube, in the names of scientists and inventors who changed the modern world, in the ambition of a people who were crushed and came back stronger than anyone expected. The question, Kossuth and Deek, DEBATED, freedom or stability, independence or prosperity, is one that nations are still wrestling with today. History doesn't give you easy answers, but it gives you extraordinary stories. And this was one of them. If you made it this far, thank you. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Leave a comment. Do you think the Compromise of 1867 was a betrayal or the smartest move Hungary ever made? I'll see you in the next one.